This is a production of Cornell University.
It's a pleasure for me to be here. This is actually one of the few things, talks that I don't give very often, so it's also very reflective. Bill asked me when I submitted the title, is this my retirement seminar? And and don't worry, it's coming. I know everyone's anxious.
The retirement or seminar?
But the both. Well, I think mostly the retirement. And as I thought about it, I thought, I could do probably 3 or 4 of these, because when you're here long enough and you get to work with enough people long enough, you start to see the ripple effects and the results and behavioral changes for the things you set out to do. So it's a mouthful for sure. I wanted to make sure I captured everything. It was a moment of weakness. I even agreed to do this, but seeing as we don't have any money to bring anybody in and feed anybody, we might as well start talking to each other about what we do. And this is what I've been up to for a while in one particular area. Anyway, I'm going to just go back here for a second and say, I work in urban environments, places where grass and plants meet people in a pretty unique way, and they get intimately associated. The academic term for the spaces that we're studying, and as we've started to study it even more recently, there's grass and there's people and there's trees and there's beds and there's benches and there's hardscapes and there's all sorts of things in the urban environment. And academically, it's referred to as green space, but my area of expertise lies in the sort of managed grasslands in the urban environment. And managed is a term that ranges from a pollinator lawn, bee lawn, to an intensively managed putting green, right? So there's all sorts of grasslands we're going to talk about. And I sort of characterize myself still as an old-fashioned extension specialist that, we identify behaviors that we believe there's science to support improving in the management of the landscapes we work in, and you implement and try to affect change in a variety of ways. And now we have millions of ways of talking to people. Man, that we're flooded all over the place with getting information out to people. And we're finding in the university realm, we're one of the few programs that actually does it a lot into the public realm. And so changing people's behaviors is a different kind of science than the studying of what I should be doing with grass and what are the physiological, ecological responses of working in a grassland system. I'm particularly going to talk about behavioral changes today as an extension scientist. Just for some characterizations, right? Urban grasslands, these are these spaces. Mark Love wrote a chapter in urban ecology around defining these urban grasslands, and they're what we call turf grass areas, right? I like the idea of it called urban because I think that space brings unique challenges. And honestly, when you ask most kids now about turf, they'll think you're talking about synthetic grass. Look at all the heads nod. Yeah, they think you're talking about synthetic grass. They don't even, and if you were a horse, if horse racing was still big, those people think it's what the horses race on when they're on the turf, right? Horse racing on the turf. So this happens to be in the background here, a lawn roof on top of a really cool restaurant next to the Juilliard School on 65th Street in Manhattan, right in the middle of Lincoln Center. And I can tell you, it gets loved to death. I worked on this as a consultant with the design firm that did it. We had to build a mock-up, and actually, it gets loved to death. And one of the biggest challenges we face is where people consistently walk in the same place all the time, much like a goal mouth on a soccer field or a goal mouth on a lacrosse field. Okay, I don't need to show you much science here. We're increasingly moving into cities, which I think most people would tell you would be a good thing, right? Any place we go, we make a mess of it. So I guess we're going to make a mess of an area, just do it in a city and build those things right and manage those urban areas correctly. And of course, I speak casually about that. Here's the Marslov's paper, chapter in urban ecology, where he classifies urbanized areas and specifically non-residential urban land use, where he talks about parks, golf courses, cemeteries, airports, things like that, school districts. This is the Bethpage State Park, where I do a fair amount of our work. This isn't considered an urban grassland. I'll make the case in a minute. urban grassland athletic fields. This has become a real point of contention. Got a voicemail message on my phone on the way over here from somebody from the Carthage School District, a retired teacher, concerned parent. Should we be putting synthetic fields in Carthage? Shouldn't we have natural grass? And it's very timely that we have a Hatch project working on exactly that. And then there's an old Levittown effect, right? After World War II, we came back and built the suburban lawn. And the Scott's company, then eventually acquired by Miracle-Gro, industrialized it with a whole bunch of inputs, just like was happening to agriculture. As those things were being imported into agriculture, they were being imported into the urban landscape. And I can tell you today, it's not any different than it was all those years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago. It's pretty much the same stuff from when it started out. It was viewed as a cultural privilege and responsibility to your neighbors. And it's been a sink. And this is a whole nother area. All urban grasslands. But of course, the characteristic of urban grasslands is that where grass meets people. I mean, it isn't just, a pasture or maybe you mow a few times a year. It's just people are out there using it. And this is Sheep's Meadow in Central Park, a place I get to visit. And we're starting to play around with some warm season grass work in there. And so apologies for any, religious connotations, but I use the word confession, right? Because, in some ways I feel like what I promote is the scientific method. I have my own belief in that if, we follow sort of how a process of trying to figure something out, that's probably a good way to figure it out. You come up with a question, try to test it, get some results and look at it. And so for me, it's always been trying to promote that scientific method to people. And the confession is I don't like studying people. I didn't get into plant science because I wanted to study people. I mean, you don't really want to talk to people when you're chasing a mower. And of course, all of us in academics, any kind of personality test continuously, consistently reveals we're introverts. I mean, who else would want to sit and read and write as much as we do if you were an introvert? And so I'll make my first confession. I don't like studying people. And yet this is a story about getting people to voluntarily adopt environmental protection standards in an industry where money is in many cases not an object. And in fact, the less money you have, the more you wind up doing some of these environmental protection standards because you simply don't use as many things. You don't simply put as much water on. You don't put as much fertilizer and pesticides on. And so this is grounded in a lot of, very strong principles that I'm sure everybody listening and watching believes in, which is, these sustainable development goals set up by the UN are places where maybe all of us should be thinking about aligning our work, I think, in a way that the world wants to align itself. And these happen to be ones in which a former graduate student and colleague of mine, Michael Becken, now works out in Norway, was kind enough to put a slide like this together to talk about some of the sustainable development goals. And then Jenny Gowan-Nifford and Grant Thompson really clarified this concept of ecosystem services into our turfgrass area. And then, of course, this has been a guiding star for us for quite a bit of time, something we were probably focused on before, but really didn't put it into this context. And I can tell you, and Carl, my colleague Carl Scamenti, who's here with me today, will also tell you, as we started to talk to our colleagues around the country about ecosystem services, they'd look at us and go, ecosystem what? There just wasn't recognition even 5 or 6 years ago by our industry, even after this paper was done, that it was widely adopted and something we should be thinking of the context with which we evaluate what we do. And now when you look at these, right, historically, the simplest place to put sort of all the bad stuff that comes around turf are that some people want it to look good. So aesthetic up here dominates the particular service when we know, especially in a city, it needs to be used. It's part of the area. It makes people feel safe. It also has all these other biological and environmental benefits that are fairly easy to measure now. Okay, well, science is pretty good. We got the UN on our side. We got a good concept for studying environmental aspects. I can get off the, everything's got to look like the Scots lawn or the center field at Yankee Stadium. And then you start to deal with trying to get people to care about the environment. And the Gallup people have been doing this for a very long time, asking people, you know, if you had to prioritize environmental quality or economic growth, how would you do that? And you see, they've been asking this question for the better part of 40 years now, right? And there was a wide disparity back in the 80s that, boy, everybody valued environmental quality. And then, as you can see, a fair amount of economic turmoil that began to occur in the early 2000s started to shift and continued to shift, right? And now we saw a little bit of a return. A lot of times this is correlation between economic prosperity and concern for the quality of life. And so when the economy's good, people have time to think about environmental quality. When the economy is not so good, people are like, oh, yeah, I can't care about that water baloney. You know, I got to put food on the table or something else. In my industry, it's even worse. Just a survey of golf course superintendents done by a major trade organization, just asking about the belief, which, you know, I sort of object to the term belief, but asking them, do they believe that global warming or climate change is affecting golf course maintenance? A full almost 40% no, climate change is a crock. Okay, so we weren't in a good position. But one of the things I've realized is nothing changes behavior as quick as regulation. And along came Elliot Spitzer in 1998, the gift that keeps on giving from my perspective. He comes in and says, okay, it's New York, we're going to pay attention to environmental quality. And in fact, there was a fair amount of data in the 90s done through a Long Island study that resulted, it was a sort of, I think it was called the 1 in 9 group, where 1 in 9 women were predisposed to getting breast cancer on Long Island. And that led to the funding and of the BSURF program here, the Breast Cancer Environmental Risk Factors program here, that we worked closely with for a number of years when Suzanne Snedeker was running that operation. It was quite a great joy to work with her back then. And then Spitzer comes along and says, okay, no problem, no more pesticides. And so did the Suffolk County Parks. It didn't occur to Governor Spitzer, who could simply ban pesticides on all state park land, right? You don't need to pass a law for the governor to say you're not going to do this on state land. He's basically in charge of that with very little restriction. And there were 27 New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historical Preservation. It's not state park. We call it state parks, but it's got a mouthful of a name. And then there were 3 Suffolk County golf courses as well. So along comes my pal and longtime colleague, Dr. Jennifer Grant, ended her career as the director, now the emeritus director of the New York State IPM program, so aptly run now by Alejandro and his crew there. Comes to me and simply says, you know, you think we could study not spraying pesticides on these golf courses? And essentially we came to conduct a project that over a 9 to 10 year period resulted in still one of the only sort of how-to manuals for IPM use on golf courses, and led to the next generation of our state park work, which I'll talk about in a minute. So Spitzer created the motivation, and we submitted a grant to the United States Golf Association back at the turn of the century in 98, 99 to study this on our research plots in Ithaca, and they said, no, you should study it on a golf course. And I said, well, who's going to give us a golf course that we're not going to be able to spray? And so along came my pals at the Bethpage State Park, who had been awarded the 2002 and 2009 U.S. Open Championships. These are the biggest events in golf that generate hundreds of millions of dollars for the nearby Long Island area, as well as hundreds of millions of dollars for the USGA or the PGA of America, as was just happened with the Ryder Cup. So the Bethpage State Park encompasses 5 golf courses, a polo field, picnic grounds, pollinator and teacher gardens. What am I missing, Carl? Bridle paths. I think that's it. It's 1,500 acres. They do about 2,600 rounds of golf a year, maybe more than that. That's an old number. The course that hosts the big tournament does about 35,000. And as far as state parks goes, it's the second biggest money generator in the state park system, other than the parking lot at Niagara Falls. Yeah, and I think followed closely by the parking lot at Jones Beach. Okay, so we had an opportunity, right, to highlight environmental principles as major tournaments were coming there. And here's another confession. I really like travel. My wife will admit maybe I like it too much sometimes. I really like traveling, and it was a good thing. For about 8 years, every 2 weeks, I got on a plane, a car, or anything that would take me there. A couple of times a limo, actually. Down to the Bethpage State Park and visit a project that was a replicated experiment on the green course, where we had different cultural management practices and different pest management practices. That was the foundation of our thinking that led to sort of what we worked on 25 years later. So that's pretty, for those of you that do it, I was thinking, I called my wife the other night as I was driving down 17, and I said, sitting there calculating, I said, I've probably driven on this road over 3,000 times. Just rough estimate, back and forth down 17. Marv, you're here longer than me, brother. I don't know where the Berry guys are, but you wear a path whenever you want to work in urban areas, particularly downstate. Now, the Bethpage State Park, here's the overview, right? You got a couple of golf courses over here. This is the black and the green. And then you got the red, the blue, and the yellow, right? This is all Robert Moses, one of the many Robert Moses brainchilds in his formation of the New York State Park System. Great book, The Power Broker, a good read, much worthy of a good read, sort of how New York, many cities got themselves into a lot of the trouble we're still dealing with today. But anyway, very urban, right? This golf course is in the middle of, you can see nothing but houses and houses and houses. This is really suburbia right down the street from old Levittown. Go figure. Well, all I can tell you is when you stop spraying pesticides on greens that were sprayed with pesticides, essentially consistently for the better part of 50, 60 years, something bad's going to happen. And what you see here is one of the many collapses that we saw on some of the putting surface out at Bethpage as part of this experiment. And sometimes it got really bad, and we even made them play on it too sometimes. And so one of the things I really learned is I love golf courses at green space, but I can't stand golf. And I'm not a golfer. Ask anybody who knows me. I will play golf, but I would not consider someone who spends money actively for the pursuit of this game in any way, shape, or form. And I'll summarize. Listen, I could give a talk on every one of these things for another 40 minutes. So let me just cut to the chase, since it's, confessions about not liking people. Well, people want to be able to just play on something. And I can tell you, and again, my state park colleagues can attest to this. We got a lot of what we would call to be shaky looking golf courses where you don't have 100% turf cover everywhere. You don't have grass covering the ground everywhere where people are playing. They still pay, they're forking their $40 over on a pretty regular basis. So they want just something that's playable, and especially down on Long Island, where there's not a lot of public golf courses, where there's a lot more private properties. There's a wide range of acceptance for this. So they just want playable condition, but you don't give them 18 holes, they want some money. They don't want to pay the full rate if they don't play 18 holes. Most of them generally think they're better than they are. And oddly enough, golfers themselves don't care a lot about pesticide use. When we survey them, they say, listen, just, don't use any more than you need. But, it's not on the top of my mind. I'm trying to break par, which is pretty much what we hear. And then I've also, when you work in these, what I would call tense environments where there's a lot of environmental activism on Long Island, we interacted with a lot of environmental groups, NGOs along the way in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. They also saw the big championships coming as a way to sort of promote their own agendas. And what I realized is some people just hate golf. It's okay. I don't like kale. some people just don't like things. There's just some things that it's okay, you don't like it, but that doesn't mean it should be banished from the planet, right? And I think you have a lot of, I mean, I'm talking about 25 years ago. This is what it was like then. As you might imagine, it's more tense nowadays. Policymakers who want to make smart decisions need help. And they get a lot of advocacy and not a lot of informed science-based information. It's hard to get it to them. And I think we've had a lot of successes over the last few years, mostly through the regulatory agencies that give guidance to policymakers. But I will tell you, many policymakers, when influenced by NGOs who vote for them, will take that decision over maybe an informed decision that science might want them to have some nuances to. So policymakers need help, and many care much about pesticides, and they're absolutely convinced if you were just organic, everything would be fine. It's no different than we see in many other production systems. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the things that we learned. And one of the things I learned, and this is a confession, sometimes being early is the same as being wrong, right? Just think about that for a second. That thing in the background is a direct injection sprayer. I wonder if there's anybody old enough to remember Andrew Landers. Used to work up at Agritech I loved working with that guy. And our industry, he would look at our industry and say, you guys are spraying like it's the 1930s still, right? We barely have any GPS used sprayers in our industry, and yet we spray big flat pieces of land many times. This happened to be something that in 2000 combined GPS technology with mapping technology. It had jockey tanks that you put the active ingredient in. The only thing that went in the 150-gallon tank was straight water, and we had 2 wet booms on it. We could spray herbicides and fungicides and insecticides out in the same band across the property because of that setup, and I became the laughing stock of the Bethpage State Park. They would point at that thing consistently and say, look at what a dope you are. There was one kid who really liked it, and he worked as a summer working on it, and then he went away, and we couldn't get anybody to adopt it again. And I worked with Toro and Raven and Andrew to develop this technology, and now it's still, 25 years later, we're still nowhere near what I believe they should all be doing. Which is really targeting on a micro level how they treat. I mean, we're trying to get robots to do it. I mean, you're trying to get robots to target these things. We could have done it 25 years ago. We had the technology to do it, not with computer vision. The other thing is we were early to the use of risk models. This was something we developed in our project with the Bethpage State Park Green Course before we went to the entire state, where we started to look into the use of predictive models primarily for disease, insects, and a little bit of weed control. And with the partnership that we've had now for 29 years with Art DiGaetano and the Northeast Climate Center, have had this forecast website that I can tell you gets, tens of thousands of visits a year. Is that fair? Tens of thousands of visits a year, particularly in the springtime when a lot of these things are going, and we've been continually adding to it. And this is important because we actually asked people about this recently, whether they're using any of these things. The other thing that came out early on from the Bethpage project in the early research days was, how do you measure pesticides? How many times you spray? How many pounds of active ingredient? Right? How much area you treat? Or was there a way to measure environmental impact? And lo and behold, Joe Kovach and the IPM folks had done a project back in 1990 and published basically a bulletin. It really wasn't a refereed publication. And it was a model that used a number of factors, including the consumer, in this case, eating. It was a comparison of organic production in apples to IPM use in apple production versus standard chemical use in apple production. And it was an indictment of everybody, which didn't make Joe happy. It indicted everything but the IPM system basically was indicted as using more pesticides than they needed to. And that didn't make Joe any more popular. And it did help him become more grumpy. If you knew Joe Kovacs, he was a treat to know. Anyway, we adapted this model for use for the golf course superintendents at Bethpage and say, hey, how does this work for you? We ran all the chemicals through it. And they say, hey, would this help you make decisions better? Wow. You know, one of the cornerstones of a good IPM program, right, is that you're weighing the toxicity of the product that you're using, right? Assuming you've gone through the normal sort of triage of how you decide, you've monitored, you've determined there's a threshold, you've exceeded that threshold, you need to engage or intervene in some way, right? This was a way you could put it to a number and say, well, a 15 is less toxic than a 60. And then we've sort of taken this apart ad nauseum. And I would imagine eventually we'll publish a paper of just this use in turf. But it's now become a pretty commonly referred to tool that honestly, for a decade, no one paid attention to. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Now, after many years of studying this and working and publishing papers, both in trade journals and scientific journals, here's my confession. Pesticide use on golf courses is about money. The more money you have, the more you spray. It's about insurance, the job security. The superintendent, it's like, you know, they don't care about money. I'm just going to spray it. It's legal to do. I'm not breaking the law. I'm not exceeding any levels. You may not like it, Frank, but it's, you know, I do this and that. Okay. And market driven. And we've learned this in the state park system very much, that the courses, once you get north of the Hudson Valley, you got really nice golf courses. They just don't have the same amount of pesticide use and nutrient use that the courses do down on Long Island and in the Hudson Valley in the upper Westchester County, where the market is more competitive and the expectations of playing conditions in those areas is a little bit higher. They certainly don't want to have dead grass. Now, we published a lot of papers. I thought for the purposes of a nice horticulture seminar, I might as well indict the rest of the horticultural crops with their pesticide use and not have turf grass systems alone viewed as ones that somehow use more chemicals than other systems. And so Michael Beckham, my colleague Carl Scamenti, former graduate student here and now department chair out in Wisconsin, Doug Soldat, and myself published a paper where we got, where we were able to procure spray records from state agencies, I believe, for these particular crops. And we had these nutrients, these pesticide EIQs that were area normalized, right? Area normalized means, you know, you spray a product with a particular EIQ on 35 acres of fairways, right? That's a very different risk than that same product on a small acreage. And you've got to normalize that in many ways because you inherently spray the 3 acres of putting greens a little bit more, as you can see here. You know, golf course putting greens actually, by our measure, use less environmental impact than potato production. And I believe this was Wisconsin potato production. New York and Wisconsin potato production. And you can see apples as well. I mean, listen, I hang around with apple people and grape people. I know how much gets sprayed. And I think when you normalize it this way for people to understand it from a broad environmental perspective, this has really started to catch on in our industry. And I'll tell you how I know that. Okay, so we worked on pesticides, right? Because there were regulations around that. At the same time, I've always had an interest in nutrient management, even though I wasn't trained in any particular soil area. As an extension scientist, I would consistently look at soil test reports, and I would never see a soil test report that didn't recommend calcium into any system it was going to be managed into, never saw it. So I always had questions about this, and along came Michael Woods, who has now been a great colleague for the last 20 years as well, where we spent 6 years together studying the problem of assessing potassium in high pH sand conditions. We published a few papers with Quirine Kennerings on soil chemistry and analytical procedures, a few with Marty Petrovic as well, looking at potassium nutrient demands and things like that. Now, no one was interested in potassium. You know why? Because it doesn't have any environmental impact. Not like nitrogen and phosphorus. Because my colleague, Marty Petrovic, had worked on nitrogen and phosphorus, had worked on it, and Doug Soldat before him worked on it. Now, one of the things that we found that I think really sort of motivated a lot of people thinking about the way we use nutrients was this picture. I think if we saw all the places this picture's ever been used, we'd be millionaires. Here's an example of not applying potassium for over 3 years to a sand-based system with a Mehlich-3 extraction level of about 20 parts per million potassium. And here we've been putting on, I don't know, I think this one might be 4x or 5x the normal rate. Here's the 2.5x. So the more potassium you added, as many turfgrass managers were doing, and the soil tests were flawed, right? We started to realize, oh my goodness, soil tests are a great way to sell fertilizer. It's literally like whack-a-mole. As soon as you get science that debunks a particular nutritional strategy, a new one pops up. So here's a confession for you. I wish people would curb their dogma about soil testing, and particularly in turfgrass systems, right? You just remember, I'm not producing apples, no grapes, no potatoes, no carrots, nothing to eat here, right? This is simply a functional system that I want to look at as an ecosystem service function, right? That's the way we want to look at it, and we have all these disservices that we've got to do. So after Micah worked with me, he went on then to do additional work that resulted in something called the minimum levels of sustainable nutrition. Prior to this, there was a big and raging debate among how to interpret the numbers that a soil test returns. And in fact, there's no surprise, surveys actually showed the more you soil tested, the more fertilizer you used. And yet there was very little evidence that adding that fertilizer was substantively improving the performance of that particular turfgrass system. And so over the years, we totally embraced this, both in our research program and in our extension program, and began to promote this with the state parks people and anyone else who would listen. And so we've been able to reduce, we used to recommend 110 part per million out of a Mehlich-3 extraction. Now I can tell you we get by in the 20s sometimes. It's they want it bigger than 37, but could easily be in the 20 part per million range. In fact, there's still studies that have gone on now almost a decade not applying any potassium to sand-based systems. And you wonder, how does the plant even get potassium? Well, it turns out the distribution of top dressing sand leads to release of potassium from apatite, those sorts of mineral deposits of potassium that are not generally thought to meet potassium needs. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of science. This is, again, another whole talk we could do. We have been able to make inroads with the DEC on some of our urban stuff. Again, no regulations here, right? Nothing, nobody's pressing, making too much of a stink about nutrient use. We've been able to work with some of the watershed people, and that's been good. So let me get back to and wrap up with the end of the story, the voluntary adoption process. How much time? As we were doing science, we were doing extension, and we would say, there are standards that you should be following, and we hadn't codified them. And then the golf course superintendents came to us in 2012 and said, we want to codify best management practices, sort of co-opting the BMP idea from stormwater managers, right? This is a concept in planners and urban situations where they think about stormwater issues and what are the best management practices to preserve water quality and water protection. Now, up until we did it, only 2 other states had done it. Florida had done it, and Virginia had just done it. And so we worked for a couple of years and wrote about 10 chapters of this particular document that became the very first online resource for this in 2016. So it's almost out there a decade now. Took the industry another 7 years to get all 50 states to do these things. And while everybody else around the country was just adopting these things, we were developing expansions. We started to work with pollinator protection, annual bluegrass weevil, nutrient management planning on golf courses. We kept building on the idea that you got to do these things. You got to do these things. And I kept saying to myself, I don't think anybody's doing these things. I don't think anybody's paying attention to this. And so along came our colleagues at the Rochester Institute for Technology, in the Golisano Institute for Sustainability, in the New York Pollution Prevention Institute, P2I, fondly known to us, who got to us because I had worked with a golf course superintendent previously who got approached again to say, hey, can we work on water quality protection things in golf courses? And then he contacted Carl and I, and we began a project that resulted in, I think, some of the most important work we've been able to do in the last 20 years, happened recently, with the culmination of a workbook and a website and a bunch of resources. We did a poster, right? And what we tried to do, and we got two things figured out. One is we realized we needed to survey these people. And so we went around and talked to 40 people, 44, 50 golf courses when we started.
Yeah, 45.
Yeah, 45 golf courses when we started. And we had 20 questions. Are you doing these things, yes or no? And when we went out and surveyed them, right, we started to see what they were doing. We looked at adoption rates. We had firsthand how people were adopting things. And then we developed some resources to inform people how to improve. And the brilliant idea by my colleague Carl Scamenti was, hey, it's golf. You should at least be shooting par. You want to get a little better, get a birdie. There's some environmental things you can do to do a little bit better. And even better, you can get an eagle and what we would consider to be the best management practices. And at the same time, because we were working transdisciplinary with the golf course superintendent, Rick Slattery, he was very keen on ace your acres, pounds, and gallons, and he really thought about saving money. He had worked at expensive clubs and small public courses and said, you know, environmental protection saves money. I don't know why people don't adopt it, he would say. So one of the things I learned, this, you know, should have been a confession, is, you know, I'm a terrible communicator when it comes right down to it. You need professional people to help you market your ideas. The idea that Extension doesn't have a cadre of marketing professionals to help us market our information properly, and we rely on Cornell Chronicle and all the other stuff that just happens here on this campus, we're yelling at ourselves. We need a cadre of people that are able to translate what we're doing in a way that people will actually embrace it. And I'm telling you, I'll show you the manual. I don't have a copy with me, but people look at this. Wow, that's pretty good. Now we're doing a national talk in February at the National Golf Conference. So this particular study, you know, what are the BMPs? Evaluate adoption. How are we doing? And then encourage adoption. This is where we spent 3 years doing webinars, field days, YouTubes, podcasts, quick hits, quick plugs. Any place we could talk about it, we did. And then we're about to publish a scientific paper where we looked at these things. And when you looked at the 20 questions that we used, we characterized them in these 4 broad areas: managing water, point source pollution, nutrient management, pesticide use, and safety. And, you know, adoption from, you know, 46% to 62%, all BMPs, from when we started, before we did the training, and after the training was done. Okay? So now we're like, okay, we did this in Western New York. We drew a line down I-81, and the 200 some odd golf courses that we worked with and the 40, 50 courses we surveyed revealed very clearly we were very effective in improving things. Now, specifically, there were some significant adoption increases in specific categories, right? Here's a nutrient management one. Now, it's not, you know, you can see improvements, documented nutrient management plan, avoiding calendar-based pesticide applications. This sort of leans a little bit into they're using forecast models. But I think at the end of the day, one of my greatest contributions might be in the cleaning business. These wash pads where people wash equipment on golf courses are the major source of point source pollution in grounds operations, bar none. And as we began to realize this, We worked with P2I to develop a guidance document, and now we're taking that to a national stage as well. Okay, as I wrap up, let me tell you the end of the story. Recently, the New York golf industry conducted an economic and environmental impact survey that looked at a lot of different things. Many of the questions Carl and I were able to curate and ask specifically, had we, are you doing this? Are you doing that? What are your problems here? What are your problems there? We've only begun to scratch the surface for the data we can mine from this place. But for the purposes of the talk, let me say, my colleague Micah Woods, who already read the survey, has already touted that New York State is using that sustainable nutrition approach and using clipping volumes to more precisely manage their nutrients more than any other state in the country, right? Now we're looking and comparing particular aspects. Okay, when soil testing, results are interpreted using minimum levels. The National Association didn't ask that question in 2004. Yep. And then 10 years later, they asked it, and only 11%. And then another 10 years later, they asked it, and hardly anybody did it. But in New York State, we're doing it. We've got it for precision fertilizer applications based on soil tests. Now, again, we're still a little bit higher numerically, right? Numerically. This is our favorite thing recently. Came from how many facilities are using decision support tools? Carl and I were very happy to see that some of the stuff we've spent a lot of time promoting, right, through our forecasting models are used more than the stimp meter, which is the single one tool that almost every golf superintendent uses to determine their performance on the putting surfaces. And I've got other data that indicates here's some of our Western New York data with the Pollution Prevention Institute and New York State data in some cases being better and in some cases not being as good, right? We saw the improvement in Western New York with a nutrient management plan because we created a click and fill in form that they could do. Statewide, that hasn't caught on. So, you're never done. My last confession is that I just love working on golf courses. I cannot help myself. I think it's from doing it from the age of 14, 15. I got to be part of the Ryder Cup maintenance crew with guys I've worked with for many years. And some of you may know Bob Portmess and Carl and Chase have been very instrumental. As much as I hate people, I love these three guys. And I really dislike crowds, but I love a good city. And while I was down at the Ryder Cup, I spoke to the New York Landscape Association down at the Botanic Garden. They took me out for Italian dinner in Arthur Avenue, got to stop through Grand Central on the way to the New York Botanic Garden. Riding the train, golf all over the train. These are billboards when I was taking the train from Bethpage in all the way to the Botanic Garden. And here is the reason we've been able to recently have some impact. Jake Sikowski, who's here with us today. Jake is a student in our agricultural science program and is a professional communicator by every measure that you can use. And with my great colleague on the launching of this survey that really validated a lot of our work over the years. Jake has been very successful in taking our content and working with Craig to get it into lots of different forms, making videos on his own. We've really tried to promote this to the State Parks Agency so that they see what their consistent investment in us has resulted in. Lots of different things internally where we got some press. We've always figured out that people who want this information like it at particular times, and sometimes it's early morning and sometimes it's Sunday, midday, maybe, who knows. But we've been able to track and get this data over the years. We've got a fair amount of local press for the work and also some international work. As you might imagine, anything sustainable tends to get more traction across the pond than it does over here. People are saying nice things in general. about us. I thought this was great. The players should have to sleep in their cars like everyone else who wants to play Bethpage. That's a long story. We've got numbers on impressions. We've got numbers on how it worked out. We've got somewhat of an estimated audience. You know, a lot of people see it, how many people engage with it. But if you get a lot of people seeing it, engaging with the engagement number comes up pretty quickly. And I will confess here at the very end, while I did mention my other colleagues, what I'll leave you with is that while I've been up to this with golf, I'm also doing it with lawns and sports fields. I work in cemeteries and large urban green spaces that, you know, that's a talk for another day. But while you walk around this campus, we've been systematically working with folks like Ag Science graduate Chris Sitko, who manages the golf course and the sports fields, and Dan Scheid, the director of grounds. And a lot of that is because Lisa James, who's an assistant vice president in facilities at the university, saw that we were willing to work with them to improve the quality of the fields, and Dan improve the quality of the campus grounds. And in both cases, especially in grounds, we've cut chemical use way down from what it was just 10 years ago, a half to a third of what it was 10 years ago. And the same with the sports fields. Now we have sports fields, natural grass fields, that are the envy of the teams that come and visit them. So I've always believed in sort of demonstrating these practices here, but also integrating the operations of the campus into our academic mission. So with that, I will unfortunately end, well, maybe unfortunately for me. So thank you. So I didn't leave time for questions.
We're out of time, but some quick questions for whoever would.
Go ahead, Randy.
It's a serious question. Have you talked to the Cornell lobbyists that are in the White House about your work?
But no.
I think you should.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Other questions?
Yeah, one quick question. So I'm more on the grape side of things, but you mentioned prediction model, specifically disease. I kind of just wonder how the training testing of that went and how you kind of got people on board to use those models.
Yeah, the training test. Thank you. The question is, have you validated these disease models? And the second part was, yes. Well, it's a slow process for sure, getting people on board. But I think because there's some risk involved, right? You have to use the models that are usually wrong, but get you into the ballpark, and you develop a comfort system with them over time. And I would say our folks who have done that because they've developed a comfort level, because every year is not the same. There are some years when the model indicates you don't really need to spray very much. They don't spray and they don't notice a problem. Other years when everybody knows there's lots of pressure, the model indicates that, they'll then play the game a little bit more. These things have been, our original one is a UMass-based model that was developed in the 90s. We published a paper in 2009 using it and found it to be really indicative of the pressure we were seeing based on the ground diagnostic data from the diagnostic labs in the Northeast. That's how we originally refined the model. And then researchers at the University of Wisconsin developed a new model that's essentially temperature and relative humidity. And it's a foliar disease thing. And I think, you know, there's a whole bunch of foliar diseases that are driven by temperature as long as the moisture's there. Yeah. So thanks for the question. Sorry for the long answer. Okay, Craig.
You had that slide comparing the ag fields with the golf courses.
Yeah.
Most farmers I know, not really fond of chemicals. They hire it out or take precautions. Golfers, they don't care about pesticides. You don't like golfers. How would those Levittown lawns where you're rolling with your teenager and your puppy compare between the ag fields and the golf courses? What is their level of chemical use if you're using a lawn care company or a weed and feed program?
Okay, well, the question is, how do lawns compare for pesticide use? And I would say that everything else combined is dwarfed by chemical use on lawns. Chemical use on lawns in particular make it, I think, one of the most pesticide intensively managed irrigated crops in the world. But that's a big nut, right? That's where I started out with Scott's. And so we work with professional commercial folks mostly. We're getting into the urban park system now where it really isn't about pesticide use as much as it's about just keeping the ground covered and safe for people to use. But to your point, Craig, when you look at the pesticide use surveys that's calculated every year from the pesticide reporting that's required by the state, you see that pesticide use is very much correlated to affluence. You look at the North Shore of Long Island, you look at Upper Westchester County, you see the most pesticide use. It's not just golf courses. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for being late and taking your time. Appreciate that.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.